Thanks, Margot, AIDA. If any opinion slips out of my mouth, it's the opinion of the presenter and not necessarily that of a couple of the board members that are still here or the EID. So we'll just get that clear here. All right, if any of you had Googled solar development in Canada, you'll probably stumble across one of these maps. It's just color-coded based on solar yield. So if you can find kind of Manitoba, they're orange colors, that's, I guess, good. As you kind of move west through Saskatchewan, southwestern Saskatchewan, there's a little bit of red, that's better. And right in the middle, more or less, in southern Alberta there, the big red heat zone, the big red blob, that's southern Alberta. So if we look at where EID is on the map there, that's the blue if you can see it there. Those are our boundaries within southern Alberta. So if you're to overlay that other map, the EID falls nicely in the southern Alberta red blob. So if we zoom in there a little bit more of the EID boundaries, to the north is the Red Deer River, to the south is the Bow River. As you're driving down Trans-Canada Highway, you come across, if you're going west to east, you'll come to Bassano. That would be roughly our western boundary. If you carry on down Highway 1 past Tilly, that would be our eastern boundary. Within those boundaries, we own 40% of the land in those boundaries, and we lease them to 10 community pasture associations. That's the vast majority of the land where that goes. Some of the other colors there, the reds and the yellows, are individual grazing leases and irrigated farm leases. And these lands are managed so that cattle, grazing, farm leases, oil and gas production, and wildlife can coexist. So why the EID? Well, we've got the sun, we're in the middle of that red blob, and we have the land. So the early days, I don't know, maybe 6-8 years ago, call it a real gold rush. We had tons of companies claiming to be developers. They all coming there wanting to option your land for 5 or 10 years. And when you really did a little bit of research on them, you soon discovered some of these individuals or entities didn't likely have the expertise or the resources to bring a project to fruition. But we did realize during that time that, you know what, solar is real. There was a few small projects starting to pop up. So we thought we'd, ask some questions with some experts, some people who know a little bit more than we did about solar. Just learn about the potential pitfalls that we need to look for. We also asked them, well, what lands, would be the most potential for development? Do we keep them in an area, or what would they be looking for? And at the end of the day, where the substations are, where the transmission lines are, and if it's a smaller development, maybe where the distribution lines are. The other thing we asked is, what protections do we need to put in these leases? What do we need to be looking for? Obviously, in the forefront in the oil and gas industry is the orphan wells and the reclamation. So obviously, that's a big one. Bankruptcy, how do, if something like that happened, how do you deal with that? In the oil and gas industry, obviously, there are protections that exist today, and that's because they can basically force themselves in onto your land to exploit the resources below the surface. Where solar, it's a surface lease, and it's much more voluntary. You're allowing them in on the surface. So we took, under advisement from the consultants. Part of the process, there is also a public consultation, and the board also put out in a newsletter that we are looking at solar development. So there was a lot of concerns that came forward from that public consultation. And of course, the biggest one is reclamation of land. Again, with the oil and gas industry highlighting, these orphan wells. Who's going to reclaim the land? Is it going to be the EID? Is it going to be the proponent, or is it going to be the taxpayer that ends up with the reclamation of these projects? Loss of grazing, as I mentioned, a lot of our users partake in the community grazing associations. Solar takes land, and cattle are not allowed under these panels. In our lease agreement, however, we have worked our magic, so to speak, and got sheep grazing under there. So while it's not grazed by cattle traditionally, we can graze other livestock there. Of course, loss of habitat. What will the impacts be to habitat? Noise. Do these things create a bunch of noise? Glare. Maybe a safety concern if you're driving by, or is it going to blind you as you drive by, or the local pilots, are they going to get glare when they fly over this? Loss of property value. If one of these projects are close to your house, is it going to impact the value of your home? Increased power rates, I think that's just more perception. People think that, well, these solar projects, well, they must be costly, and therefore power rates will go up. Poor use of land, takes too much land, or the wrong land. There is regulatory things in place that determine where it's going to be put. As an example, we get lots. Well, why don't you go put it on not this good land, put it over on that land? It might be alkali or a wetland. Well, it's a wetland, and there's regulatory issues around that. And of course, the favorite one, and it's very common. I think solar is a great initiative, but don't put it near my house. Put it on beside my neighbor. So, of course, there's always in any decision making, there's a risk reward. From the district's perspective, we're very comfortable with land leases and negotiating the necessary protections. We have lots of oil and gas leases, and I have a slide demonstrating that here in the next one. We've got irrigated leases, private grazing leases, transmission tower leases. So we're not adverse to leasing our land. And no doubt that is one of our strengths in our district. It is our revenue generator. So we leverage our strength. Solar, on the reward side is revenue generation. Irrigation business is very capital intensive. So, anytime we can leverage our strength, which is our land, and generate some revenue, I think that's important. So just as an example of the amount of leases that we do have, we have 8,400 wells on the land base that we have. And it averages, it's a little over 3 acres actually, but in this calculation I just went with 3 acres. So 25,000 acres. So we do get the arguments, well, solar takes a tremendous amount of land. Well, oil and gas takes a lot of land as well. And one could argue maybe there's more noise, depending on what they're producing, of course. There could be more traffic, again, what they're producing, more dust. This acreage doesn't include the trails, the pipelines, the roads to access some of these wells. So one could argue it's significantly more than 25,000 acres. On the flip side, so to speak, we do anticipate quite a bit of reclamation coming on these leases, maybe 100 or 200 wells a year. So anything that we end up putting in under solar development, the land, could be offset by some of the oil and gas being reclaimed. So just to put perspective as far as the revenue generation, very simply, 1 year of solar land rent is equal to 200 years, over 200 years worth of the present grazing revenue. So pretty significant, pretty compelling, and tough to argue with. So that's for the district. There's also tremendous revenue generation for the county. If we look at the tax base, a grassland quarter in Brooks is $45.40 per quarter. So you divide that, 160 acres roughly, it's a whopping 28 cents an acre is what they're receiving. Versus, and it's hard to maybe quantify depending on the orientation, and the size of some of these developments. I tried to do some calculations, but it would probably, if we look at the year one, and it's year 1 to year 7, the way the county tax base works, for the first 1 to 7 years, probably $1,000 to $1,500 per acre. So 28 cents versus, let's say, $1,000 an acre. Of course, as it depreciates in value, the county taxes would be lowered as well, but significant. And then the other thing is economic development. If a certain amount of solar gets in there, critical mass of solar, you know, what other industries might be attracted because of that solar? So just in summary now, by far less proponents, probably the last one standing, probably have the expertise and the resources to bring a project to the development stage. Obviously a very polarizing topic, wide range of opinion on every facet of solar development. I can almost guarantee you, even if you agree with solar, there'll be one aspect of it that you'll disagree on. Lots of misinformation on both sides of the ledger. I think we all tend to read what we want to believe, but obviously you have to balance that out a little bit and look at the other side. Risks can be mitigated with informed decisions and addressed in lease agreements. Do we know all the risks that we're up against? No, probably not. We won't. But we know some of the risks, and we hope that any of the leases that we entered into have addressed the risks that we think are there. Public regulatory permitting processes are evolving and working. Again, some would say they are, some would say they aren't. And renewable energy, including solar, is likely here to stay and grow as power demands increase. Obviously, solar there's only a certain, there'll be a saturation point that solar can produce for energy. But as that increases, it will likely increase proportionally. And EID's history shows that oil and gas production, cattle production, wildlife recreation can coexist. And we believe now solar can be part of that portfolio. The EID doesn't have anything built yet, but we have a few projects in varying stages and potentially one to be built starting in spring. And with that, I'll turn it to you.
Okay, thanks, and thanks to both of you for coming out today. It's good to see you there. So, talk a little bit now about solar development in the BRID. First, here's the map showing most of the land BRID owns. I'm pretty sure we're the second biggest landowner among irrigation districts, but you know, if prizes for being first and second were proportional, EID gets the Stanley Cup, we get an empty pop can. So we own land, but not much compared to them, but more than the rest. So on this map, the lands that we own are shown in green. The little black circles, incidentally, are pivots that the BRID owns. And you can see the solar projects in the district are shown in pink there. We've got RWE Solar just north of Vauxhall. That project is actually in operation. We have Solarcraft Vauxhall just to the northeast. That one has been approved by the AUC. We're anticipating construction later this year. Proteus Power out at Hayes, where the X is. Progressing along, there's a public open house tomorrow night on that project, and Lost Lake shown there is a little BRD owned microgen site that I'll talk about a little as well. And you can see the two local substations shown on there, and of course substation locations are important relative to solar development. I wanted to just show what we do with our land base right now to put solar into context here. So these are 2023 budget amounts and the approximate areas dedicated to various uses. First off, grazing, that's been the traditional one in our district. So about 1,850 irrigated acres and 9,460 dry acres. We're budgeting $170,000 for an average of $15 an acre. The dry grass is far lower than that on average. The irrigated grass drives that price way up to a whopping $15 average. Irrigated cultivation leases. So we have 3,300 acres total for irrigated cultivated leases, of which 2,300 are on the 15 pivots that we bought ourselves. 1.1 million, so averaging 330 per acre. The numbers, of course, are much higher on the pivots that we own and lower on the pivots that are owned by the producers. Oil and gas surface leases, we only have 180 of them, so about 580 acres, 450,000, so averaging about 777 per acre. Sounds like a Boeing aircraft. Solar leases, 520 acres is what we're budgeting for this year, 410,000, so averaging better than 750 per acre. That's our starting point for solar rents. So total lease revenue of about 2.1 million. Average over the acre base, so that's $7.35 per acre, and if we didn't have it, instead of being $17.50, our water rate would be up there at close to 25 bucks like some of the other higher price districts. A little history of our commercial sites now first. So back in about 2016, as I recall, the gold rush that Ivan referred to, we had so many tire kickers, coming around because they all wanted to lease our land, and it's like, how do you know what's good and what isn't? It sounded all right. Bottom line is we engaged Peters Energy Solutions. A lot of you might remember Joe Peters, who did significant work for the AIDA to help us evaluate our sites. We then selected our 2 best sites to tender the development rights, and one key here was we applied for, as the BRID, for capacity at the Vauxhall substation to connect a project, and we were granted some capacity there that we reserved, so that was good. So that was something we could offer in our tender. And we had several interested bidders. We did not take the highest price. We went with the one that was offering what we thought was a really good price, that as we were trying to read their bids, that we thought these are the guys that are actually going to build something instead of just paying us, option fees forevermore. The first project was completed in 2020. It's now in operation as RWE Vauxhall Solar. RWE, a huge German utility. Second project was approved by the AUC late last year, and we anticipate construction in 23 here once the substation that is required for that project gets its own separate approval. And we do have another lease agreement in place with Proteus Power out near Hayes for a large project that's independent of that process that we went through previously. And our role in all of these is simply landlord. We collect the rent, the developer builds and operates the project and flips it to another company, and so on. Just to look at the ones we are talking about then, here's what RWE Vauxhall looks like from the air. It occupies a little more than a quarter section of land, 22 megawatt distribution connected project. It's only half mile south of the Vauxhall substation. The previous land use, it was all pasture, leased to one of our grazing associations. Lots of flood irrigation on that pasture, but very poor soil qualities. Soil tests would not allow us to irrigate it if it were not grandfathered in. So poor soils and lots of oil gas pipelines cutting the property up. That's why you see these patches with gaps in between on the map there. So the Solarcraft Vauxhall project, a bigger one, 60 megawatt connected to the transmission system. The panel location shown in light green. It'll occupy portions of 5 BRID quarters, that's the 5 south ones, as well as one privately owned quarter to the north. It does require a new substation to connect to the transmission line, which you can see on the map there. Current land use and all of that is dry grass, really poor soil qualities. We did soil testing, seeing if it's suitable for irrigation, but not a chance. And again, lots of oil and gas. A good part of our oil and gas leases come out of these 5 quarters. So yeah, solar fits well there, we believe. And then our final one, Proteus Power, looking at 3 separate phases there. The first 2 phases, which are not sequential numerically, phase 1 and phase 3, a little over 20 megawatts each, and then a very large phase 2 at about 185 megawatts. The smaller 2 will be distribution connection. We're not far from the Hayes substation there. The larger phase would be transmission connection, hoping to be in operation in 24 for the small phases and 25 for the big ones. Based on our experience with the others, I think that's probably slightly optimistic, but who knows, maybe it'll go very smoothly. Current land use is primarily dry pasture, a little bit of irrigated pasture, and a little bit of cultivation there as well. And again, all land on this one owned by the BRID. Talk now about this little Lost Lake solar project. Ivan, could I get you to pass me a glass of water up here? Or Margot, thank you. So we developed this one with ATCO Power, 25% grant from Emissions Reduction Alberta. It's a 407 kilowatt project, so just a dinky little thing compared to the commercial solar. We have 3 400 horsepower or 297 kilowatt pumps at Lost Lake, and our typical pump volume has decreased by over 70% in the last 20 years. This project became operational just about a year ago. In 20 and 21, our power costs were about $82,000 a year each year, and our power cost last year was less than zero, so that was good. Project cost just over $800,000 in total. A little bit of history on this Lost Lake project then. Lost Lake collects all of the runoff and spill from our west block of our district, so large area, maybe 80,000 acres or so, and it all flows into Lost Lake, and most of it is return flow off our canals historically. So we have a pump station there that was built in the 80s to pump that water back into the main canal for reuse. Prior to that, it was pumped north and just wasted to the river. This solar concept actually began in 2019 as a pilot project for solar panels over irrigation canals in Alberta. The idea was we were going to put panels over the canal to the pump house. Alberta Agriculture wanted this to happen. They had a significant grant available for one pilot project. BRID won the AIDA competition to be the pilot project, so we did a lot of work with ATCO on that, and bottom line was we just could not make the project cost work relative to the amount of power that had to be generated, and that was strictly because of the high cost of putting trusses over the canal to support panels as compared to just driving piles on the ground to support panels. So it was really kind of sad to see that happen. Again, ATCO made a great effort. But then we worked with ATCO to build the project as it exists now instead, piles on the ground beside the canal, and that project operates under the microgen regulation, and again, really appreciate ATCO for their great work and Emissions Reduction Alberta for their great grant. I wanted to talk a little bit about, a little more about the panels over canals, because you hear a lot about how, well, gee, they do it in India, therefore it must be good to do here, or they're thinking about it in California, therefore it must be good here. So there's a photo of our Lost Lake, and you'll notice that the spacing between the piles is 17 feet. And that apparently, obviously, would be what they deem to be an economical sort of spacing to make that thing work. Fairly light channels supporting the panels. And any canal in Alberta that is 17 feet wide, well, there's not many of them left, and the ones that are going to be pipelines much sooner than later. So you're really talking about bigger canals. Again, we're not the only ones that hear, gee, they're doing it in India, you should do it elsewhere. The USBR and the operators of the Central Arizona project, hear the same thing, gee, they're doing it in India, so we should do it here. So the Bureau of Reclamation did a serious study looking at putting solar above irrigation canals. That picture, of course, is from India. And the results of their study were this. Results indicate that putting panels over the canals would make the project 24% more costly than putting it on ground mount solar, and that's because the trusses over the canals would cost 9 times more than the support structure on the ground. So when a significant part of it costs 9 times more, yeah, your total project costs 24% more, just not economical. They go on to point out that, of course, it might shade the canal some, and that's certainly a good thing, but the benefit is really small relative to the cost of doing this. And to put it into context as well, a cap canal 65 to 114 feet wide, that is smaller than the BRD's main canal. Ours is bigger than that, and all the engineers in the room know that it's not just a linear relation to cost as you do a truss, it's exponential as you go longer. So very, very costly to span the sort of big canals that we have that will be canals forevermore instead of going pipeline. And of course, evaporation in Arizona way more than in Alberta, so if it doesn't make sense there, I'd say it makes even less sense here from the let's reduce evaporation argument. Another aspect to it is that solar panels over canals would certainly complicate many of the routine sort of maintenance activities that we do. They're not going to eliminate all aquatic growth in the canals, and sometimes we need to do things like, cut the weeds manually or drag them out with a chain. The tumbleweeds blow in, and I'm sure solar panels, all those trusses across the canals would be just awesome for intercepting tumbleweeds and making them deposit right there. And if you need to clean the silt out, which does happen time to time, again, got to move the panels before you're going to dig the silt out. So, one of those ideas that sounds good, but when you start really thinking about it, maybe not quite as good. And then the other thing that I would think is an issue as well is, simply the alignment issue. Fixed panels, which are the cheapest, should face south on trusses that run straight east-west. That's how we built Lost Lake. That's how I think every fixed, support solar is built, is point them to the south. Single axis trackers, which are the commercial ones we're seeing, they're certainly more efficient and more costly, of course, and they should, of course, be pointing east in the morning and west in the evening on trusses that run straight north-south. As you can see, here's our typical canal, which doesn't look too much different from, many other canals. It does not run straight east-west or straight north-south, with very few exceptions. There's the odd place it does, like right where I pointed to. But if you want to get that preferred alignment, then you're going to have your trusses on a skew, so they're going to be very long trusses and just that much more expensive. So really not economical at all. So I guess my thoughts are this, there's some technologies that may make perfect sense one place and less sense another place. And here's an example that some of you will know what I'm talking about, and those of us that know, we should never forget this one. But after seeing that, gee, they're making concrete line canals in Arizona and California, and they're really smart there, so we should do the same. I guess we forgot about the fact that when the ground freezes hard, it moves, so concrete didn't work so well here. And I'm not saying solar would be a disaster here, just that, again, just because it works well one place doesn't mean it's necessarily the answer in another place. And yeah, that's my presentation. So Ivan and I will take questions.
How long are the leases on the commercial project?
25 years with options for automatic renewal for another 10 years, followed by another 10 years beyond that on our Solarcraft ones. And for the other one, it's very similar. I think it's slightly different, but very similar. The thought is that probably after 25 years, they'll want to repanel because the panels will still be producing power, but they become less efficient with time. So the thought is that they'll likely at that point, whoever's owning it, make a decision to use those perfectly good piles that are in the ground and all that good wiring and the good substation and throw a new set of panels on and keep going further.
And it's an option at the sole discretion of the...
That's right, yes.
Well, actually, that question leads perfect into mine. We talked a little about reclamation. With oil and gas wells, of course, eventually they run out of oil and gas and have to be reclaimed or the company goes bankrupt. But we're not going to run out of sunlight, so is reclamation a big deal or just replacement of the panels?
I suspect you're right. It's more likely replacement of the panels. Because yeah, if we run out of sunlight, we got way bigger problems than reclaiming the solar farm for sure. And again, the leases, they were well reviewed by lawyers that have helped sponsor those wonderful breaks we've enjoyed. And, we believe we're adequately covered. And I mean, nothing is 100% certain other than death and taxes, right? But we do believe we're well covered in terms of reclamation not falling on the district. And even there, worst case if it did, reclaiming an oil and gas site, that's not something we'd be equipped to do. It's not rocket science to build a solar farm, and I would think it's even less rocket science to take one apart. I mean, undo the bolts, take the panels off, take a chain and your excavators out there and yank the panels or piles out of the ground if you want, or leave them there as scratching posts for the cattle that'll come in once the panels are gone. I don't see it as being a really big deal. There must be a question for Ivan.